again, it can't be one-to-one because the Oasis and the Matrix are very different systems. But and we're geeky enough that we understand the difference between the two.
and care about it.
And we care enough. And you're watching us talk about it. You're part of our delusion. That's our cold open. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 2 of And Another Thing. I am your host, Drew Weisberg, as always, which we can now say because it is, in fact, episode 2. We've gotten enough off the ground that we have a second episode. Joining me, as always, is Isaac Wilde, my co-host. And today is a very exciting day because this episode was actually the impetus for this podcast. Today, Isaac will be talking to me a little bit about Snowcrash by Neal Stephenson, and I will be talking to Isaac a little bit about Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Isaac, what is Snowcrash for the people who don't know?
Excellent. So Snowcrash is a book by Neal Stephenson, and it falls under the category of the genre cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a really fascinating genre that it's an offshoot of postmodernism in the 1980s, and the genre has two calling cards, which is one, hyper dystopic capitalism, where companies run everything, the government is powerless, the poor live by the billions in these small shacks, and the rich own 99% of the wealth. And the other facet of cyberpunk is virtual reality, where there's a matrix, a cyberscape that you can escape to get away from the horrors of this gray capitalist landscape. So Snowcrash falls into the genre, and it's an exemplar of the genre.
Sure.
It's a pinnacle of most of these ideas. The setting is humorously capitalistic, where the main character gets arrested and he's given a choice. He can purchase the luxury jail package or the clink, which is state-sponsored and it is just a crummy place to live.
One of the most interesting parts that I found when I was reading Snowcrash was the fact that the franchise, the franchise nature of everything, which is incredibly funny to see, is the idea that nations can become franchise states.
Or like in the 1800s when Pepsi was the world's 9th largest military, and that's real. You can look that up.
Little Hong Kong, or the franchised Hong Kong, which becomes almost a political neutral zone.
Yeah,
in a number of parts.
And you
of the
can
story.
find pockets of Hong Kong corporate territory in different places, and you purchase the right to live in Hong Kong, spread out anywhere in the geographical world.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think that element allows Snowcrash to play with some really interesting satire.
Oh yeah, it's very humorous for such a terrifyingly bleak landscape. Several parts in the opening chapters really did have me laughing out loud at the eerie absurdity of how close it was to our own reality.
Mm-hmm. There's a great commentary on sort of the suburbanization of cities.
Oh yeah,
that I think you're a bit more qualified to talk about than I am.
A key facet of the landscape in Snowcrash are called burbclaves, which it's like the idea of gentrified suburbia full of these white rich people taken to its inevitable extreme, where these people opt to live in burbclaves, which cost a ridiculous sum to live in, have the best laws that money can purchase, have a really high tax rate, have no crime, and are highly militarized.
So there's the idea that these burbclaves are divided up by not just nationality, but ideology. The idea that, as you move up the ranks in this sort of, as you say, bleak capitalist landscape, you do get to a point where you can choose you do not have to adhere to the morals of your surroundings. Your surroundings can adhere to your morals, which is a really interesting idea that is very cyberpunk.
Yeah.
In that idea, but it's not. Again, it's playing with the fact that it's not just corporations that are controlling the landscape. It's a lot more of sort of politics, and not just politics being the interactions between nations, but the interactions between groups. The main character's name is Hero Protagonist.
Yeah.
Hiro, protagonist. And that to me is, there's a great scene that's very self-referential where he hands someone his business card and it says something to the effect of Hero Protagonist. It's pizza delivery boy, hacker, and greatest sword fighter in the world. And someone goes, your name is Hero Protagonist? And he goes, you'll never forget it. And that was Stephenson calling us out directly.
Yeah, in this kind of postmodern vein of being self-referential to the own work, to like point out to have the work point out its own form and to mock itself. Yeah.
It's fun though, and I don't want to just keep saying the book is fun, because it is a genuinely deep, profound piece of literature.
While it has all of these pulpy aspects that make sci-fi a pleasure to read, it also contains an incredible wealth of analogies and references to other literature, to Sumerian mythology, weirdly enough. And it's got a lot to say about like the dissolution of language and how communication falls apart.
Yeah, there's a very interesting idea of the sort of matrix in this world is very different than how a lot of these digital landscapes are imagined in cyberpunk. In cyberpunk, they're often these almost, I don't want to say fantasy settings, but they very
close
much are,
enough.
They're wish fulfillment.
Yeah.
And this is a very utilitarian look at how a space like this would exist.
It serves a super pragmatic purpose in life rather than an entertaining one.
Mm-hmm. Which it feels closer to what we have available to us now.
Yeah.
In terms of virtual reality than maybe what something more akin to, well,
Ready Player One.
The Matrix in Snowcrash is that it's described as this almost night-esque, very blocky. Things are more outlines than they are.
Yeah, I have a very distinct image in my head of this black monolithic pyramid with no description or ornate facets to it. It's just like a block, as though the computer programmer just wrote, generate rectangle XYZ, and rather than more accurate to what a lazy computer programmer might actually design.
I'm glad you brought that up, that idea of a programmer and a tangible author to the world, because probably one of the most interesting scenes to me is explaining, because Hero is a sword fighter and he has swords in the Matrix as well.
Yeah.
And he at one point slashes a dude in a club, and he describes how he wrote the code for the animation that's taking place.
Yeah.
And he completely pulls all the mystique out of it. And it's so, to me, telling of how Stephenson went about writing the book.
Yeah.
Because so much of the book is about demystifying cyberpunk.
That's a great point, yeah. To take all of the too often the genre has flashy escapades of epic proportion, but to actually go into the world building and be like, how would that work? How would a person write a computer code to allow two avatars to duel each other?
There's a definite feeling that this is not your typical cyberpunk world, and again, I feel like there are only so many cyberpunk stories that get told anymore.
Yeah.
It often sort of devolves into wish fulfillment.
The genre runs a very tried and true route in a lot of cases.
I think the problem is when you get to versus maybe fantasy
Yeah.
or sci-fi, where there's core tenets, but there's more core ideas. With cyberpunk, it's sort of a genre within a genre in a sense. It's sort of a facet of science fiction. And as you start to zero in and get closer to maybe it almost adopts like a core set of rules.
Yeah. Too often, cyberpunk does feel horribly defined by a very concrete set of rules that to break away from the rules would be to render the book no longer cyberpunk. So Stephenson does a great job taking these limitations that too often make a story very linear and predictable and totally branching away from them. And if there's one thing to talk about in Snowcrash, it is the infamous opening chapter, which functions as a terrific standalone story. If you have 20 minutes to give to the opening chapter, it'll blow your mind. But in the opening chapter, he is a delivery boy for the mafia, because the mafia in Snowcrash owns the pizza factories. And their motto is, in 20 minutes or the delivery boy gets killed.
Right.
So hero protagonist has to deliver pizza within 20 minutes or his life is forfeit. Which means that he's allowed to break every law in terms of driving on the streets or killing people who gets in his way in order to deliver this pizza. Which is why he has 2 katana swords strapped to his back.
It's one of my favorite intros for a book ever.
It's like the Deliberator had 2 swords strapped to his back and armor like textbooks strapped to his stomach. And he's just delivering pizza.
But it's a great showing, and it's a fantastic first chapter because it really does encapsulate how absurd this world is.
Yeah.
And how utterly goofy this heightened state of pure capitalistic excess has gotten to, where you get to a point where you are so focused on your own carnal desires that you are willing to accept that this pizza was fought for with swords and lost blood to deliver you your pizza in 20 minutes. Ready Player One is a story by Ernest Cline wherein the main character, Wade Watts, completely defies everything that we just complimented Snowcrash for. And the reason Ready Player One is our companion piece this week is we were so excited to talk about Snowcrash and how much we liked Snowcrash that I felt we should balance it out with something. And what we chose was a story where it is cyberpunk-ish, but it's wish fulfillment. It's self-inserted. It's odd. It's an odd book. And so we'll just get into it. So Ready Player One is essentially based on a world in which the world is functionally falling apart. There are gas shortages. There's an oncoming famine. There are RVs that are stacked as apartment buildings, essentially, because the world is just over-urbanizing and running out of space. The feeling at the beginning of the book is one of deep claustrophobia.
And while we may criticize Ready Player One, I do have to admit that the idea of these camper vans stacked on top of each other is a pretty compelling way to show that the depths that the physical world has fallen to.
One thing I will compliment Ready Player One before anything else is said is that there are solid ideas here. There are solid ideas.
Yeah.
There is a short story here, maybe.
Yeah.
But I feel like there isn't enough for a full-on novel. And I'm really glad that this never became a franchise.
That's for sure. We had to sit through Disney's remakes of Ready Player One, the sequel trilogy.
It's more just that this idea just didn't have enough steam. So the basic plot of Ready Player One is, in the future, there is a virtual world called the Oasis. And the Oasis is the brainchild of James Halliday and Ogden Morrow, who are the two founders of Gregarious Games, if I'm getting that right. And they have created this oasis that is a virtual world in which anything is possible. And it's interesting because all these different franchises license out the rights to their characters and their worlds. So there are sections of the Oasis that are... One of them is the entire Star Wars galaxy rendered in reality. And there's ships that are often from different... There's
full Dungeons and Dragons dungeons that are like actual real-life modules that I've actually played through, rendered in the Oasis.
There are references to Ghostbusters. There are references to... It's actually easier to say what there aren't references to.
And honestly, I couldn't think of... I'm sure if you picked any facet of popular nerd culture, Ready Player One's Oasis contains a reference to it.
I noticed a few, but that's also because we're super nerds, so I think we would notice that thing. There's a great... Actually, that aspect is also the greatest weakness of Ready Player One, is it's such a smorgasbord of nerdy references that the plot itself is very thin.
Yeah.
The plot, continuing on from my own deviation, is essentially Ogden Morrow sold his shares, got out of the company. So then it was just James Halliday running this world, which is no longer just a game. It actually becomes a center for commerce. And digital items in the Oasis begin to have real-world monetary value and vice versa. So coins you earn in the Oasis can become the way you actually purchase real-world items. People are literal farmers for loot and weapons and exotic items, just like in an online role-playing game. And I think that this is where I see an immediate deviation from Snowcrash, because Ready Player One is more focused on the virtual world than it is on the real world.
Yeah.
Almost immediately. And what's interesting is, again, I'm getting off track and I should just stick to the plot. So the plot is James Halliday passes away, leaving all of his shares, his entire fortune, which I believe accounts for $500 billion.
Yeah, an immense sum.
And he says, whoever can beat this quest line that I've put into the Oasis will inherit my fortune and the Oasis, which, if you remember from maybe 2 deviations ago, accounts for the entire commerce chain for planet Earth.
It's supplanted the real world. Owning the Oasis is like being king of the world.
You are essentially unregulated and have access to an entire universe unto yourself. And so our main character, Wade Watts, is a gunter, because this is an Easter egg. So they call themselves egg hunters and shortens it to gunter. And he has spent the better part of his life learning everything he can about James Halliday, but also the James Halliday's childhood in the 1980s, 70s to 80s, I believe. And so as the Halliday fever caught everyone, the world almost regressed to an obsession with 80s pop culture, to the point where there are very few things in the Oasis that are from modern popular culture.
Right.
I think the most recent reference I recognized was Firefly, I think.
Oh, which is still pretty dated.
Which is a show from the early 2000s. And I don't think that read as, oh, James Halliday liked Firefly so much as I think Ernest Cline liked Firefly, which, power to him. Firefly's a great show.
That's true.
But I'm not going to say I don't like Firefly. It's my favorite show. But it's interesting because you get to this point where one of the videos I was watching commented on this, and they said, Ready Player One is very dystopic if you really stop to think about it, but not for the reason, but the book doesn't present it as such. because the book has essentially said that culture is dead in Ready Player One.
The real dystopia is that the world is frozen in 1980s culture without hope for evolution.
Mm-hmm. Which the book never really, brings up, and the book's conclusion doesn't change that fact.
Yeah, you want to discuss how the story ends?
I would like to discuss how it ends.
Spoiler warning, of course.
Big spoiler warning. The book does end after a long journey. Wade Watts, savior of the universe, completes the Easter egg hunt and becomes the owner of the Oasis. And at the end, he gets the girl, wins the day, and decides to pick a few days out of the week where the Oasis will be non-functional. So pretty much imagine that you suddenly, the world's commerce, the internet didn't work for 2 days a week.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what Ready Player... Which, by the way, school is on the Oasis.
Yeah, everything.
Everything is on the Oasis.
Your entertainment, your friends,
And that, to me, and the idea is, Halliday would have wanted everyone to go outside and experience the real world.
Yeah. The moral at the end of the story is shoved in without any regard for what the moral that the rest of the story had been building up toward.
Ready Player One has things happen to characters, and that's supposed to be seen as growth. When in reality, nothing about their worldview or their ideology changes and evolves to fit the story. It's ironically what Snowcrash is preaching against. Being a main focus of Ready Player One is the idea that the world will eventually bend to your ideology. And at the end, the character is rewarded with the ultimate ability to bend the world to his ideology. And in that protagonist's hands, it's dangerous because he doesn't really have greater aspirations.
Yeah. In Ready Player One, the end goal of cultivating the world to your own ideology is a glorified ending. It's a positive ending for the story. There's cheering and crowds and stuff. In Snowcrash, on the contrary, the bending of your surroundings to fit your ideology is treated with the terrifying heaviness that it should be treated with.
Mm-hmm. Ready Player One is a very light book compared to Snowcrash.
Yeah. Although light, and the irony is that they both deal with the same issues. Mm-hmm. One touches the surface, catches the sparks, and glorifies them, mm-hmm. and the other goes to find the ashes and coals that originate it all.
The writing styles of both are very utilitarian. And I use that word very selectively because the prose in Stephenson's writing is often not beautiful. It can be.
In fact, it's sometimes pretty blocky and on the nose. If there was one thing to criticize Snowcrash for, it's that Stephenson is wildly imaginative, but yeah, you could never call him a literary great.
It almost feels as though you're reading a screenplay in certain aspects.
That's a good point.
You feel as though you're reading scene descriptions in Stephenson's work, and it communicates exactly what he means to say. Ready Player One tends to communicate things in a very digestible way, but there is no art to the prose. Stephenson is meaningful, whereas Ready Player One is direct. And
that's a good distinction for sure.
I think there is that element of, I was leafing through Ready Player One again, and I just kept noting to myself, I was like, these characters are just talking. They're not saying anything. They're not talking. And it was fascinating because it especially becomes infuriating when the book clearly wants this to be an "oh, of course" moment, and then it just comes off as blatant bragging. One of the things that's infamous in Ready Player One is the fact that Wade is prepared for any scenario he comes across, and nothing poses a challenge.
Yeah, this goes back to the never punished idea. Mm-hmm. That you should say a little bit about the guitar scene, because you've read this most recently.
The guitar scene, it's so disappointing for me to talk about this because this was my breaking point with this novel. This is when I put the book down for a little bit and I went outside and I felt the breeze on my face and I just kind of said, you got to do it for the show. This was my sacrifice for the podcast.
This is all for you guys.
This is all for you at home, everyone. But there's a scene where Wade finds a guitar that is clearly the impetus for the next clue. It's clearly a marker for the next clue to the next key to the egg. It's all part of this grand game. And Wade, with no sense of irony, goes, it's a good thing I learned to play the guitar. And then he plays Rush. It's interesting that Wade doesn't ever really understand anything beyond Halliday's likes and dislikes.
All of Wade's knowledge, there's a classic distinction between intellect and wisdom. Mm-hmm. Wade's got all of this intelligence about everything, and he has none of the wisdom to put it into context. And yet, in a more well-crafted story, this would be a point of criticism. This would be a flaw that Wade has to overcome. But the novel glorifies the fact that all Wade has is intelligence.
Right. Wade is a singularly focused character. He's not that complicated. No. And one of, I think, the scenes that, to me, set the tone for Wade pretty early on is that Wade just goes on a one-page rant about how God isn't real within the first chapter. And you're just sitting there going, okay. And you kind of think maybe that'll be sort of a Chekhov's gun for religious ideology to come back in the book. No. And Cline goes on a couple of those tears throughout the book where you sit back and you think to yourself, okay, is this Wade Watts telling me this?
Or is this Ernest Cline telling me this? We've been talking a lot about meaning, like that we wish the story had meant something. But I also think in a more meta sense, it's also, it ties into the reason why we're talking about it. And it's because we think that these stories have a lot of meaning to them. It's like we could so easily fall into the pitfalls Wade makes where we talk about these media without understanding like why they were written or how to change ourselves or our outlooks based on the conclusions that we draw from them. So
this is why we wanted to create this podcast, because we really felt like Ready Player One is just the definition of fluff reading. And the dangerous part about not thinking and turning off your brain. And then there's the danger that you might not turn it back on.
Yeah.
With that, I think we're going to close this episode down. I'm glad everyone's back. I'm glad we're back for episode 2.
Glad we're back for episode 2, for sure.
We'll come at you as soon as we can with episode 3. But it's always a pleasure. This has been And Another Thing. I've been Drew Weisberg.
I'm Isaac Wilde.
And that's it. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.